Welcome, everyone, to Season 3 of the Fantasy Formula, and we're kicking this year off by bringing you everything you need to know about the Australian Grand Prix. This year, we'll be joined by one of the best F1 fantasy creators in the game. That's our good friend, Zach Allen. Zach, we're so excited to have you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be joining FanAmp. It's going to be so fun this season. Me and you and Terry, we've got so much content to come out, and let's get this show on the road.
This felt like the longest offseason ever. I'm so glad that fantasy is back. We've got our featured league. If you haven't joined that yet, be sure to check out the link in the description below. Zach, what from the preseason has you the most excited to kickstart 2025?
Honestly, it's got to be just how much they're talking about how close the whole field is. Now, I'll believe it when I see it, but I've just heard so much with that even the top four buffer to Williams Alpine could potentially be just so slim. Oh, that just excites me. And of course, this season, coming into a new regulations, last time that happened, we had 2021, and we all know just how crazy that season was. So maybe I'm hyping 2025 a little bit too much, but in my head, that's the connections I'm making.
And you probably don't have to ask me what my favorite thing is. It's Lewis Hamilton making his debut with Ferrari. You have the sport's biggest star, the most iconic constructor on the grid coming together. This is going to be a huge season for both of them, I'm sure. Now, before we begin today, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss a single second of our content all season long.
So this is our new tier list, and as you can see, we have a buy area and a sell area, and then we split it off to below 15 million, which realistically would be your cheap drivers and constructors, and above, which is top four constructors and all of the drivers in there. So, as you can see, going over to our tier list, we've got quite a few things to say because we also have this on the fence situation where you could bring them in, you could also sell them. We've also got some constructors we need to talk about, especially in the top four, because constructors are so key. You've got to get these right. But keep an eye out on those drivers, especially the cheap ones, because you need to make sure also that your team isn't left out on the cheaper side of things, and make sure you get those cheap drivers right.
And this is the first race of the season, so there's going to be a lot of different team choices. So we got very busy buy and sell sections, but don't worry, we're going to walk you through all of our possible team choices to set you up for this weekend. So let's start with the constructors, because like Zach mentioned a moment ago, we've got to get the constructor picks right because they score the most points on the grid. If you haven't seen our changes video about the rules for 2025, the constructors are going to get even more points for fastest pit stop. They already get the extra points for quality teammate points and all of the combined points of their two drivers. So I always like to start my team with two solid constructors, and you can see there are three good ones right here. These are three of the four top constructors on the grid, and we'll talk in a moment about why McLaren's not on this list despite being the best team arguably on the whole grid.
And it really is one of those things with these constructors, as you have to make sure you're, of course, thinking about the points output they can bring in, but also the budget. Now, Mercedes, very much, even with the pit stop points, I think they're the sort of outlier in the top four. The pit stop points don't really help them too much, but it's just their price. They are so much cheaper than the rest of the other constructors, such as Red Bull, Ferrari, and McLaren, and they're still going to get you a lot more points than any other constructor below them would. Same thing for Red Bull, but this time round, a little bit more pricey. They also now give you a lot of pit stop points. So Red Bull have now all of a sudden come right back into the mix of things where I wouldn't have really thought about them this season. I don't know how you would have felt, Adam, about them, but for me, definitely Red Bull wasn't something I was thinking of before the pit stop points.
No, I was lukewarm on them at best, and I think the pit stop points have definitely brought them back onto my radar. And even Mercedes, I wasn't totally sure about them this year, but I'm looking at the forecast for this weekend. It could be cool, it could be rainy. That falls right into Mercedes' sweet spot, so I'm liking them for this week. Now, at this point, if you pick two out of the three constructors you see on the screen here, that's going to burn up a lot of your cost cap. So how are we going to be able to afford the right drivers to round out this team? Let's start with the top three drivers on the grid and why I can't pick them this week. Even though they have the top three betting odds to win this race, let's look at Lando. Lando and McLaren combined this year are more expensive than Verstappen and Red Bull were last year. And remember how bad it turned out for teams like mine that ran Max, Red Bull, and V-Carb because you couldn't afford anything else? I've got to avoid both Lando and the McLaren constructor just because they're too expensive.
Completely agree. It's actually quite crazy how they have Norris at such a massive price. I honestly can't see many people picking either of these three, because even Leclerc, he's a bit cheaper, but compared to Hamilton and Piastri, it's still just not enough. Especially, again, I keep coming back to this point of constructors being so important. And it just doesn't leave enough for a Norris, Verstappen, or a Leclerc.
So I've done a little workshopping on this, and if you pick Lando, McLaren, and the four cheapest drivers, the only constructors you can afford are Alpine, Haas, and Williams. Not good. And now if we move on to Max Verstappen, think about his history at Albert Park. He has one win in his 8 races at that circuit, and his last 2 DNFs in his F1 career are in Australia. So I'm not sure I want to roll out Max right away. And then Charles Leclerc, too. He's now 6.8 million more expensive than he started the season last year, and only 0.2 million less than how we ended the year, and our budgets are much smaller. So I can't quite afford any of these guys, and expects to have good constructors too.
Because we can't bring any of these 3 drivers, it brings us to the drivers we can bring in for our teams. And I'll start off with Piastri. This, for me, is my favourite coming into Australia. Now, he can put in a shift in that McLaren. We know the McLaren's going to be fast, so that's not an issue. And by the way, at 23 million, he is a gold mine. It's crazy how low they've put him, considering where Norris is. And I don't think there's that much of a difference potentially coming into 2025. Now, I would like to add as well, with Oscar Piastri, it's his home Grand Prix, which potentially could lead to Driver of the Day points. So we know in Australia, there's never been an Aussie driver, technically, because Daniel Ricciardo did stand on a podium, to get a podium. And I do think that if Piastri just gets a podium in Australia, he'll get those 10 extra points. And if you have Piastri in your team with the 2 times DRS boost, you could be getting similar points to a Norris, Verstappen, or Leclerc with the better constructors.
And remember, even though we couldn't pick the top 3 drivers on the grid, the 2x boost is still a big part of our teams. We've got to get a good enough driver to round out our lineups and still have a fighting chance of points this week. So one of these 3 drivers is going to be really important, and I totally agree with Zach. I think Oscar Piastri, in his home race, with the potential for driver of the day, could be one of the most selected drivers on the grid this weekend. He was also P4 in this race last season, so he's got no problems at his home race either.
The other 2 drivers you could have at this sort of price range is the risky one of George Russell. He doesn't have the best history here. However, at his cheap price, it means the rest of your team could improve elsewhere. And it's the same as Hamilton-ish, where Hamilton's still just cheap enough to still bring in those best constructors. How do you feel, Adam?
You know I'm going to be behind Lewis Hamilton at Australia. He has the most pole positions at this circuit with 8. He also finished P2 and P4 in 22 and 23 in some really suboptimal Mercedes cars, so I think he'll be just fine in Ferrari this season. So if you can afford Lewis and 2 good constructors, I think you'll be just fine too. Now, Zach, let's take it on into the midfield because we've got to round out this team. We've got good constructors. We have a good 2x boost driver. Who's standing out for you in the midfield?
Oh, now, 100% we need to talk about both of those Haas drivers. They seem like a run, get your money. It's robbery at this point, honestly. They are so undervalued for me at the minute, considering where some of the other drivers are, such as your Gasly, Tsunodas, and so forth. To have Haas's at 6.7 million and 7.3 is incredible. And I know in preseason testing we didn't see a lot from Haas, but I can't see Haas dropping down that much for them to be priced like this. How do you feel about the rest of them?
Just to comment on the Haas for a second, let's think about Bearman's 2 prices when he was with Haas last season. 15 million and 13.3 million, and now he's coming in at about half this year. It just seems like a steal to me. And keep in mind, Kevin Magnussen, who led all drivers in value gain last year at 8.8 million, started at 6.2 million last year. So not much lower than these Haas drivers now, and I think they're going to be a key source of cost cap gains for us this year. Also, Haas finished P9 and P10 in the 2024 Australian Grand Prix, so I think this car will be fine this weekend. As we look at the rest of the midfield, I think they looked a little too much into preseason testing when they priced these drivers because poor Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon are really, really expensive. No Williams cost more than $9 million at any point last season. And the Williams drivers started at $5.5 million and 7 in 2024. So I think these 2 drivers, for a car that hasn't proven anything to me just yet, are a bit too expensive.
Completely agree. And funnily enough, I would like to talk about another driver pairing here, and that's the two Sauber drivers. Now, I like to call them the dud drivers of F1 Fantasy, and I think it's going to be the same thing this season, where they are just dirt cheap. And in F1 Fantasy, you want to be able to know exactly where everyone is. And with how the point system works, funnily enough, you want your cheap drivers not really to qualify well. If they're P12 or P13, it's probably worse than P19 and 20. And for me, 100% with Bortoletto, cheap, will probably qualify P20, and if he just survives the race, he might get a few positions gained from a few DNFs, or he might get an overtake. So it's a really reliable, safe net of points, considering how crazy it can get in the midfield.
You think about the Australian Grand Prix 2 years ago, it had the most retirements of any race on that race calendar. I think there were 3 red flags throughout the course of the afternoon here, so all he has to do is survive, and that could be a lot of points for us. And if you're worried about Nico Hulkenberg, who historically qualifies high and drops down during the Grand Prix, Jack Doohan could be a safe bet at his home Grand Prix. There's no driver on the grid more motivated than Jack is right now, and if he has a clean Grand Prix, it could be a great start to his season.
And sort of in a similar light you were just talking about, Adam, with Doohan, you've got Hadjar, where he needs to prove that he deserves that Racing Bull seat. And again, he's just a cheap asset where he's a rookie. His qualifying might not be the best, meaning he's got more chance to not get any negative points in a race. And it's just a safe bet. I wouldn't say it's as safe as the double Sauber options, but if you want a bit more of a riskier option, at which is still okay, I would go for Hadjar.
Yeah, he's a differential play, he's a cost cap enabler, and until he proves otherwise, perfectly fine.
I think that brings us on as well to we've called it our on the fence section. And it does get quite interesting here because, especially with the drivers, Gasly and Alonso. I will start off with Gasly. It's the same sort of reason for both of them as to why you can't really choose them. And again, it comes back down to constructors. There is no room for Gasly and Alonso in your team. They are just a bit too high up in price that you can't mix around your constructors, a premium driver, and still fit them in. So it's annoying to not be able to bring them in because I do think Gasly will be good. And Alonso, even an Aston Martin that's not that great, would still be, for me, a decent asset considering 8.8 million is not expensive. It's so weird how even being that cheap, it's just on the cusp. Maybe in a few weekends where we see the pricing changes and stuff, then we could bring him in.
I think that's the allure, is that when you look at that starting price, it's so low for both of them. It's really tempting, but the only way you can make it work is if you sacrifice that 2x DRS boosted driver or one of your constructors. I'm just not willing to do it. So fingers crossed those prices go down, or the Adrian Newey in a few months works some magic for Aston Martin, and then we can invest in Alonso more confidently.
You never know.
There's one other on the fence option that we want to share with you, and that has Liam Lawson as the 2x DRS boosted driver. And I know that's a little bit lower than some of the drivers we talked about earlier, but that allows you to bring in the McLaren and Red Bull constructors. So you're really counting on constructors to get all of your points. Hope that there's some upside in Liam Lawson, and maybe you have a shot in the dark at some big points too.
100% with this team. It's also, you've got to be careful because it's very much, you're not thinking about budget. You're just going for that full-blown points. And yes, I do think having constructors of Red Bull and McLaren with the pit stops, with how their teams look, they will get you brilliant points. But this is where in F1 Fantasy you get our strategic minds where you've got to start looking ahead into the future. And when people are able to build better teams than they are now with the 100 million budget, you might get stuck behind and then teams will catch up and pass you.
I want to plant this seed in some of your ears because I know a lot of folks are looking at China, the very next race for the Limitless chip. Remember, your cost cap changes for the Limitless chip are from the team you had in the previous race, and that's this one. So I would be careful if you're using this lineup and want to use the Limitless chip in China because you could be setting yourself up for some big price swings, for better or for worse. So when you put it all together, here's our tier list for Australia. We want to buy drivers like Piastri, Russell, and Hamilton in the expensive class, sell drivers like Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, and Charles Leclerc in that same expensive group of drivers. And then for our midfield and back markers, we love the Haas and Sauber drivers, and we're not a big fan of the Aston Martins and Yuki Tsunoda and Lance Stroll. There's a few sketchy ones in there too.
So we'll now head over to some of the lineups we've been thinking of that you could run in Australia. And the first one I quite like. Now, of course, like we mentioned, it has one of the premium drivers of Oscar Piastri, who would be your 2x DRS boost. And I can't emphasize this enough that you have to have a decent driver for your 2x DRS boost, because that literally doubles the amount of drivers' points, and then all of a sudden they're scoring close to what the constructors potentially would score, although with the pit stop points, maybe still a bit behind. Then you've got the double Haas, double Sauber. Again, very cheap drivers, but they're going to be reliable. So it's a safe option, especially because, yeah, you could have Hadjar and Doohan, but like I said, it's a bit more of a differential. You don't know exactly what those rookies are going to be like. And then constructor-wise, you have to go with Ferrari and Mercedes because those are the ones you can realistically buy with that budget. We're at a very tight squeeze at this point of the season, but you can't go wrong with the Ferraris. Again, Ferrari, like Adam said, especially in Hamilton's, got a good track record here. Leclerc ain't too shabby as well. So with no doubt in my mind, Ferrari will be a good constructor to have. It's the Mercedes I'm a little bit on the fence about, but you just have to deal with it.
So we're hoping here that Piastri and Ferrari are doing the heavy lifting for us. And if it's a cool enough day, that Mercedes cold weather performance really shines. So that's the benefit of this team. And for those of you that want to spend exactly 100 million, there's a slight variant to this team with Ferrari, Mercedes, Piastri, Ocon, Bearman, Bortoleto, and Doohan. It's exactly 100 million, but you don't have to spend all of your budget, but keep it in mind. All right, so if you want to take it up a notch with your constructors, there is this variant with Red Bull, Ferrari, Russell, double Haas, and double Sauber. This means you're going to put all of your faith in those constructors. You're hoping that George Russell really turns some of his Australia form around after a run of bad form in these last few years. But again, in the triple header that ended the 2024 season, Russell had the most championship points of any driver on the grid. So maybe he's taking a corner, ready to lead that Mercedes team. So this could be a good differential as well.
100%. And I think you have to look into George Russell potentially on a season look instead of an Australia look, if you want to bring him in, because it does look scary bringing Russell in just for Australia, because we all know what happened last year especially. But season long, Russell, especially with how close the field could be, we know he's a decent qualifier. If he could just, get himself into that podium positions, all of a sudden you've got two brilliant constructors that will probably score more than the Ferrari Mercedes build, and then potentially he could get more points than Piastri. We'll see how it goes.
And then underlying these teams that have Piastri or Russell as our 2x boosted driver is the hope that the cost cap changes will hit these cheaper drivers more favorably than those three top-ranked drivers that we didn't bring into our team. So there's a balance here of points and aiming for that cost cap growth too.
I'd like to add as well, with these teams, we're in a weird situation with it as well, where, funnily enough, for me, I'm sure you're the same, Adam, we're actually talking about hoping that if the likes of Russell or if Piastri doesn't win, I would much prefer Norris and Verstappen to get most of the points, because not a lot of people are going to have them. So at the end of the day, it wouldn't actually affect us too much, especially Norris, because he's so expensive. If he did get all of the points, you're going to catch up with the rest of your team. So it's such a weird feeling to be saying, yes, please, another driver I don't have do well.
It's going to be a long season of that, I think. They really nailed the pricing in 2025, so there's going to be a lot of us pulling for our drivers and really hoping that the other guys don't win. Now, lastly, this is our on-the-fence team. So this is the McLaren and Red Bull build, where you have super constructors, lots of pit stop points on the table, potentially the top 4 drivers in this race if everything goes well. But then with your 2x boost, you're hoping that Liam Lawson really delivers on that promise that Helmut Marko and Christian Horner had invested in him to be that driver of the future for Red Bull. So it's risky, but you have lots of points waiting for you in the constructors.
Now, finally for this videos, we need to talk a little bit about the chips. And to put it simply, you shouldn't be using any of them. It's not a sprint race weekend, so you're not going to be getting the maximum amount of points you could get on a weekend, which is when you'd be wanting to use a limitless or a extra DRS. It's also very early on in the season. We've got free transfers up until Australia, so don't use wildcard. And then on the no negative side, I'm still not looking very much into it. However, we'll keep an eye on that weather forecast. We could be saying something different on the deadline stream.
Now, for this year, we've taken two of our favorite segments from previous years and combined them into one. It's our fifth gear Garms contest and the FanAmp pick of the week. So now, if you head over to the FanAmp app, get involved with our pick'em game, you'll compete against Zach, Terry, myself, and fans from all over the world. And every single week, we're going to give away a great fifth gear Garms prize to one of you. Now, I know their new line for 2025 is really, really sharp, and we'll be debuting some of their new line in the coming weeks.
So excitingly, for the 2025 season, we have a featured league over on F1 Fantasy. I can't wait to get that started. It's going to be brilliant. As of recording for now, we have around 5,000 people already in this league.
And we'll be back this Friday, 1 hour before qualifying for our deadline Q&A stream. So come, bring your lineups, ask us any questions you have, and we'll reveal our teams for the Australian Grand Prix. And also, feel free to leave us a comment below if you have any questions about the rule changes or want to start workshopping some of your lineup ideas. We'll be hanging out in the comments.
We love helping all of you people out, so let's get the show on the road.
See you this weekend.